Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nailing Your Thesis, our course on how to perform research. So we reviewed over the prior parts of this course how science works in general, and then we spent particular effort on discussing and explaining and in the homework trying out different research methods. But after all the research has been done, and sometimes already during the research being done, you need to write up your work. You need to present it or try to present it to the world, which in the research context means you write a research paper typically, or in the context of a final thesis means you write your research thesis, your final thesis. And that is not trivial. In fact, communication of your research results is critical to actually getting the rewards of your hard work. If you don't communicate it, it will not be recognized. It will be recognized for someone else who manages to communicate it. And in order to get your work published, that's what it's ultimately about, you need to get it past peer review. So you do need to communicate it, and you need to communicate it so well that it actually gets accepted for publication. So from now on, the next few sessions will be about how to achieve that. How to write well, how to write well. And for that, we need to understand what a research paper is. Paper is a funny term. It's obviously a very general word. In the context of science, a paper is a research publication. For example, an article in a research journal or an article in a conference proceedings. It becomes a research paper in the sense that it's been accepted by the research community if it passed peer review and will be or has been published in one of those outlets, journals or conferences, etc., proceedings, where there is academic or research quality assurance by way of this peer review. So you need to earn your stripes by getting it published in a reputable publication outlet. Similar to a research paper, research thesis is a written presentation of that research work that you performed. In this case, the quality assurance and the review is done usually by your supervisor, a professor who will give you a grade for it. And it's usually a precondition for graduating. So recapping, the purpose of publishing your work, rather than just doing your work and forgetting about it, the purpose of publishing your work is to get the information out. You want to make that contribution to the progress of science. You actually also want other people to say this is good work. Maybe you overlooked things, so that seal or stamp of approval that you get from the publication is helpful to reassure yourself that maybe you didn't overlook anything, and hence there's additional quality assurance of your research. If you are an academic or if you want to have an academic career, that's how you gain currency, how you gain credits, and ultimately you build a research career from a sequence or a string of research papers that you published over time. There's a classic model of how not just one, but multiple research publications relate to each other. As your work matures, you may be refining and extending your work. So you build on prior work, and you might be creating a series of publications that all need to be different, so no self-plagiarism, but that are incremental in that you sharpen your results, you improve your results, you add additional data and experiments and insights, and in such a way that you end up with a journal paper summarizing all of your work. So you might write technical reports where you report about the progress of some experiments, for example. Technical reports are publications by, say, a university or self-publications. So there is usually no peer review. Technical reports from that perspective don't count as quality research papers. But once you have sufficient quality in your work, you may go to a workshop with it where you present your work first, and then discuss it with peers in that workshop. And some of these workshops even have proceedings that make your research work a published paper if there are proceedings. But the usual assumption or interpretation of something that calls itself a workshop is that the quality criteria are somewhat relaxed, and you were invited to present your work as part of ongoing work, which may not yet really have reached some final conclusions, so they're only intermediate conclusions. Different aspects of your work, however, may reach a certain quality, so you may raise the bar of the quality you're trying to meet, and that will usually be met by conferences. So high quality conferences or medium quality conferences are the next step. Here, serious peer review is supposed to take place, and thereby serious quality assurance. So if you get your paper accepted for presentation at a conference and publication through the conference proceedings, that's the wording, then you already have a reasonable research paper on your belt. And sometimes you have multiple conference papers and additional publications, and it all feeds into one concluding high quality but also high level but also longer journal publication. That is the traditional model. That's in particular how, for example, information systems still does it. In computer science it's different because conferences and journals are competing for being recognized as the highest quality level of a possible publication. And also this model, also in computer science, journals and conferences would try to be at the same level here. And also this hierarchy of lower quality papers feeding into a larger one is really being not so prevalent or common these days, as people simply try to get out every paper at the highest possible level they can. So rather you just see a sequence of papers and not necessarily a culmination in a summarizing journal paper. So basically what people do is get as much academic currency back for whatever research work they did, and if the conferences keep rejecting it, well, then they'll just fall down and try a workshop. Of course, it's highly upsetting if you shop your papers around like that, but that's part of the reality out there. Anyway, so here's a very early PhD comics cartoon. So the PhD student is talking to the professor, and the professor says, "I read your draft, great work. I just made some minor alterations." And then the PhD student recognizes, ooh, he wrote the whole paper. The conclusion is, well, says the professor, you don't want to embarrass yourself on your first publication. No, the lesson here is not so much that professors are arrogant towards their PhD students, but that indeed, even if you've done great, logically structured research work with wonderful results, presenting your work to the academic public has lots of arcane ways of how it needs to be done in order to be recognized, and those arcane ways aren't necessarily obvious or logical. So writing research papers is hard because you need to learn how to do it, and it comes with its own funny rules. But the really hard work, the science, you probably already did, or since you're writing the paper, typically after you got some results, you did most of the hard work already. So here's one aspect of why writing research papers is arcane. What are you doing? One PhD student asks the other. Oh, I've got to make sure my paper complies with all the submission guidelines. The submission guidelines in this case is just an inordinate amount of requirements on how to format your paper, what font size, what the margins are, how the formatting of the caption for some figure is supposed to look like, and on and on and on. And the joke here is, oh, it's a conference about creativity and science. The only place where you should not be creative is in the layout of your paper. Anyway, Many things in paper writing, once you understand them, are quite mechanical. Here's the first rule of writing. Applies to scientific writing as to probably every type of writing. Know who you're writing for. Know your audience. And in the case of research papers, this audience are the reviewers, the gatekeepers who will help decide, who will make the recommendations as to whether you accept your submission, your paper, for publication or not. Then the editor in case of a journal, or program chair in case of a conference, who will review the recommendations made by reviewers and come to their final conclusion on whether to accept or not accept your paper. And if you got it accepted, typically your peers, meaning the other researchers who are interested in the type of work you're doing because they are probably busy in that same field. Here's the process of reviewing. So you as the author write your work, and at some point of time you believe you finished the written presentation of your work for one paper or one thesis, and so you submit it. That's the terminology. You submit it for consideration, for publication. And then the editor looks at it, and the editor, say of a journal here, is responsible for a particular topic area or field of research. And if your research publication does not fit that field, if the editor believes it's wrong audience here, wrong field, you'll get your paper rejected right away. It's a so-called desk reject. It does happen because sometimes researchers get confused about where they should submit, or if they're shopping their paper around, they're getting desperate and they're submitting to ever more foreign to their subject journals or conferences, which will lead to more desk rejects. In any case, usually the authors or researchers know what they are doing, and hence they submit to the right journals and conferences. So then the editor will select reviewers, typically for quality reviews, at least 3 independent reviewers. And the reviewers will then receive your papers and your submission, and will review it, which is an informed opinion with a recommendation on what to do about your paper. The editor will collect these reviews, read these reviews, compare them, and come to a conclusion. That is, make a decision on your paper. And it's ultimately an accept or reject. And so the author would be happy or not. There are some in-between states, which we'll discuss later. For now, you need to know that this review process is what your paper goes through, and that you need to be aware of as you write your paper if you want to be successful in the end. And it's really that a professor, even though they are editor and reviewer in one person, will still apply the same criteria usually as a reviewer does, and that will ultimately determine your grade in case of a final thesis. So what is a reviewer? How is a reviewer looking at it? It strongly depends, of course, on the topic. But there are these two basic dimensions that we previously looked at, which are rigor and relevance. These are the two core dimensions. Rigor, how rigorous, how high quality is this research work from a method perspective? Are the contributions real? Does the data show that? Are the methods or the use of the methods, is it believable, so the data wasn't fudged but really is a result of properly applying the methods? Do the authors understand the limitations based on the data they got and the methods they applied and the context it all happened in? How rigorous was the work is one core question, and the other one is how relevant is the work, how important is the work, which may, for example, balance out some lack of rigor if you can only show that this is serious, important insights to be gained, even if there is some uncertainty about some aspects in it. So is the addressed problem real? How important is the problem? And and of course how high or how important is the progress you're claiming, and etc. So next to rigor and relevance, the two key dimensions of evaluating a paper, sometimes are social factors as well. Do the authors properly put their work into context? That's usually tied to the related work section, where you show that you know about other research in the area. This is a social proof point, if you will, as to do you understand what field you're working in. You need to understand that a reviewer looks at your paper, and maybe it's 10 pages, and wonders, what is it that they are not telling me? And there are lots of things you're not telling the reviewers because you only have 10 pages. So that needs, typically reviewers look out for social proof points that somehow indicate you really understand much more about the domain and how your work compares with the other work in that domain, so that your claim to progress of science is valid. And if you fail these tests, then all of your results become more suspicious. Anyway, so here's rigor versus relevance. The Holy Land, or the land of publication, is a combination of sufficient relevance and rigor, and it's the gray area here. And if you don't get enough of both, then your paper will not get published. If you only have relevance but no rigor, it's an opinion piece. If you have extremely high rigor but no relevance, nobody cares, so it might also not get published. You need a minimum amount, typically of both, but it's the combination of both that makes the successful paper. So then, research papers, and similarly the suggested layout of final theses with us have a structure, and it's always the same structure. And so you need to understand this particular structure if you want to write a successful paper or final thesis. That structure is illustrated here. There's a context, the opening of the paper. Then there is the part on related work, in also context, but in detail as to by relating your work to other researchers' work. Then there's the actual contributions. Only this part, third part, is about the new research you did. And then there's finally conclusions, meaning the closing of the paper. In terms of size, if you will, pages in a paper, these vary significantly. These four parts have different subsections. So the context really is the title, the authors, the abstract, and the introduction. And the purpose of all this is to orient the reader, set up the context so that they know where they are, give an indication of the contributions you're claiming to make, but without showing them yet in detail or even validating them, but thereby also claiming what the progress is and the significance of that progress that you claim to have achieved. Related work usually is just one section, and it puts your work into context. And if you will, it also defends, looking forward, how your work is different from other work, and thereby why it's warranted, if it's good work, which remains to be shown, how it's warranted that it should be published. Then comes the bulk of the work, the contributions, and these contributions are usually three sections: a discussion of the research question or theory, a discussion of the approach or methods applied and the data they gathered, and a discussion of the limitations or challenges or threats to the validity of your work. So that's really the presentation of the meat of your work. Without this, there wouldn't be a paper. So here is where precision is needed in every section. At the end, you conclude, meaning you present any potential conclusions that can be drawn beyond the discussion of your work already and its limitations. You list the acknowledgements, you provide the list of papers you referenced, etc. Here the critical part is getting the conclusions right. Usually it's a reinforcement of your message, so that people will keep in mind what it is that you achieved. And the rest, like list of references, is basically just mechanic. All right, here in one page you see by percentage of work, or the amount of size at least in writing, that each of these sections takes. You can see how the blue part, the contributions, theory, validation, limitation, that's up to 60, 70, 80% of your work. Let's assume this is a 10-page paper. Then you would expect title, author list, abstract, introduction to be perhaps the first page, related work perhaps be the second page, and then you have maybe six pages of theory of your contributions, theory, validation, limitations, and then on the last, now you have 2 more pages on with conclusions and acknowledgements. Then the reference lists, if you have lots of references, can steal a lot of space. So be light on references and be heavy on references is both good advice. If you're light, you get more space for your contributions. If you're heavy, you're showing you know your stuff, I can put it into context. There's a balance to be struck. All right, so that was an overview of what goes into a paper. We will look at this in more detail over the next few sessions. I make a distinction between the actual writing that we will go over in the follow-on sessions in this set of slide decks and sessions. And we will also look at the scientific community in yet later sessions to see how publications fit into a context of research and the scientific community. That's it. Thank you very much for your time and see you in the next session.